guys in the dark.
Before my mom was married and had kids, she used to work at a big bank in the downtown area of my city as a supervisor. Back then in the 70s, $11 an hour was a big deal, so she made pretty good bank and would stay late to make sure everything was locked up and safe. She used to have coworkers who would sometimes sit in the top lounge and eat and just chit chat. One night, they decided to bring a Ouija board. She told me that back then, she was sort of agnostic and a curious Catholic. Not really practicing, but she still had her beliefs. Her coworkers were playing with the board and asking it dumb questions like, who was cheating on so-and-so and other meaningless things. They were laughing when my mom walked in and saw them, and they invited her to come play, but she declined and said, "No, I don't play that." So the girls made fun of her for saying that and that she was superstitious, being a chicken, etc. My mom didn't care. She knew it wasn't exactly the safest thing to do. They kept on playing while she got her things out of her locker, and then she said the girls burst out into a sort of humor and horrific laughter because supposedly the planchette moved. She told the girls, "Ask it, does the Bible condemn you?" The girls smirked at her, and one of them rolled her eyes and said, "You're so boring, but okay." She asked the board the question, and my mom stood in the doorway watching them. She said the lights in the room flickered 3 times, and the planchette started to move on its own, and the girls were screaming as they lightly touched it and spelled out, "Damn you, get out." She said the planchette flew off the board and hit the wall, and the girls got up screaming, and one of them was actually crying. My mom also mentioned that ever since that night, that lounge always had problems with lights turning off and on by themselves, and people never felt comfortable going in it anymore. She said everyone started to move to the lower lounge room, and the top lounge eventually ended up becoming a storage room for documents and papers.
I have a terrifying story about a Ouija board. I got a call from my cousin who said that he, his brother, his dad, and his best friend were using a Ouija board in their basement. Prior to starting, they took a large porcelain doll out of the room because it was creepy, and then placed it in an adjacent room face down on a pile of towels. My cousin took a short break because the board was just spouting nonsense. He went to go take a shit. His dad and brother and friends started asking the board questions about him. One of the questions was, who is in the other room? It just started spouting random numbers. And when my cousin came back into the room, his brother said that it wasn't working, that they were going to put it away. He showed him the answer to the last question that he asked. And he said, "Dude, that's my social security number." Then they started to talk to whatever started spewing answers out. It told my cousin that he would die in the Air Force. At this point, they tell the entity that they are communicating with to prove itself. It then spelled out the word doll, and they were like, "What the fuck?" They opened up the door to go check on the porcelain doll that they had laid in the other room. When they opened the door, the doll was standing upright in the front of the door, staring right at them. Everyone had freaked out and ran out of the house. His best friend burned the Ouija board. I think he temporarily went nuts for a few months. My cousin, for some reason, then joined the Air Force and is on a base in Europe now.
My first story takes place at my grandma's 2-story detached house in the summer of 2018. I'm 15 and I was hanging home with 3 of my friends, which I should mention are all girls, and I'm the only guy in the group. At this time, the sun had started to set and we had just finished some beers. And honestly, we don't drink too much, and I personally don't like beer. But just so you know, we started to get really bored at this time, and I decided to search for something for all of us to do. It was something similar to a Ouija board. It's kind of like a ritual. You have to set 3 pairs of 6 cards and a candle in a dark room with all the lights off. Now that I gave you a bit of foreshadowing, let's get to the really creepy shit that happened. I should mention, We were at the first floor of the house, and also, we have a Labrador, and her name is Laura. As we began playing the game, I placed the cards and the candle, and then turned off all the lights. We sat there, and then I began asking the classic questions. Every card symbol is a word. A spade means no, and a heart means yes. A diamond means maybe, and a club means no. For every question I asked, the answer was no, and one maybe. My friends had started to get bored and made fun of me, and they left the room. They passed the hallway and got to the other room, and the only thing that separated us was a wall with curtains that I could talk to them through. And, well, I just continued to ask questions. Similar to things like, is someone here now that I'm alone? And it was a yes. I then asked, are you a woman or a man? And it was a maybe. At this point, I wasn't afraid, honestly, I was just more curious. I then asked, how old are you if you are real? Then chills ran all over me, but I continued to ask the same question 2 more times. I then heard the slow rhythmic tappings. I ignored it, thinking my friends wanted to scare the shit out of me. And then again, the rhythmic taps. They were more aggressive this time. I snuck through the dark room towards the door, thinking it was one of the girls, and I wanted to scare them. I opened it, and there was no one there. Even the dog wasn't following anyone around. I began to freak out. I ran through the hall to the room where my friends were, and I see them all sitting there comfortably. And in a panicked voice, I asked, who the fuck was tapping at the door? They all looked so confused, and then they said to me, stop being so crazy, no one hits doors. After some arguing back and forth, one of the girls, let's name her E, wanted to go back to the room with me, so we went back. Once we got there, I asked the same question. How old are you? Now, imagine someone banging the door, but with its finger bone. It was the sound we heard after the question. We turned on the lights and never touched those cards again.
One summer, 3 middle school boys discovered a Ouija board in the trash bin outside of a local apartment building. Tom, who happened to be the oldest, was terribly cruel to the younger boy, Josh. He often would punch him jokingly in the arm, but so hard that it had bruised him. Other times he called Josh stupid and other cruel names. The third boy, Chris, remained silent to avoid the abuse. Secretly, Chris and Josh disliked Tom's behavior, but they tolerated it because they had no other friends. During that summer, the 3 boys had took the discovered Ouija board to Tom's house, where he was alone most of the time. His father was always working, and his mom had died many years earlier. As the boys sat there in the living room with their hands on the planchette, they grew bored after 20 minutes of waiting. And then when they were about to give up, it budged. Finally, it spelled out Getaway. Get away. I live here, Tom barked at it. It started moving more briskly in the figure 8. N-O-W. That's weird. I wonder what it means, Chris said, glancing at Tom and Josh. He looked back at the board. Where should we go? Chris had asked. I-T-H-U-R-T-S. This is stupid, Tom said. He looked at Josh and Chris. You guys are doing this. Let's test it. Josh, let's go. Josh removed his hands from the planchette. Now ask it a question that only you will know, Tom had ordered. Josh immediately asked, who's the person who keeps hitting me? Tom gave Josh a nasty glare, but it was moving already really quickly. Ask Tom, it answered. This is stupid, Tom said. D-A-D, the board had spelled out. Huh? Chris said, staring at the board. I think this question is for Tom. He glanced up at Josh, and they exchanged some confused expressions. D-A-D, it spelled again. Tom's breathing started to race. His face had turned red. Sweat formed on his brow. D-A-D, it spelled even a third time. Tom jumped up and ran crying from the room. It was the first time that Josh and Chris had ever seen Tom cry. They only learned a few days later that Tom's father routinely abused him. Somehow, that Ouija board knew Tom's innermost secret. Cindy was 13, and the middle child in a large Christian family who lived in the mountainous country of northern Maine. She had 3 older sisters, a younger sister, and a younger brother. At some point during the 8th grade, a friend had let her borrow a Ouija board. During that weekend, Cindy and her older sisters played with that board. They did so in secret, late at night, because they knew how strongly their parents would disapprove of it. That weekend, the mysterious talking board mesmerized Cindy. She became obsessed with it. She could think nothing else, and soon had a list of questions that she wanted to ask the board. Cindy had an hour every day after school where she was alone in the house before her older sisters returned from high school. So one Monday afternoon, right after getting home from school, she cautiously crept up to her room, set up the board on her bed, laid her fingertips on the top of the pointer. After just minutes of sitting quietly, it started to jerk softly across the board. It spelled out "Hi." Cindy's breath caught in her throat. "Hi," she answered. "Who are you?" J-A-K-E. A shock ran through Cindy. Jake was a friend of hers who had died in a car accident in the 4th grade. "Jake, is this really you?" Cindy had sat up, her arms shaking with excitement. The pointer moved quickly up to yes. Over the next hour, Cindy held a conversation with Jake. Every day after school, Cindy would race up to her room to communicate with Jake about her life and the future. But after a few days, the conversations became darker and angrier. By the 2nd week, Cindy had the impression that she wasn't talking to Jake, but instead with a dark and terrible imposter. Finally, by the end of the 2nd week, the entity revealed itself as a demon, threatened Cindy that if she told anyone about their conversations, she would die. That Friday night, her sisters had got home. They found Cindy curled up in a corner, crying. It took a week in a mental health facility before Cindy would recover from the emotional damage that the entity had caused her during those 2 fateful weeks.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.